Today, I'm going to tell you the story of Sarah White Elk, a Native American woman falsely accused of murder in 1883. When a lynch mob gathered to hang her for allegedly poisoning a white child, rancher James MacReady risked everything to uncover the truth. But the truth was more shocking than anyone imagined. Please subscribe to our channel and comment where you're listening to this story from. The accusation that shook Cedar Falls. The September heat pressed down on Cedar Falls, Wyoming Territory, like a heavy blanket soaked in sweat and dust. Main Street buzzed with an unusual energy for a Tuesday afternoon in 1883, as townsfolk gathered in clusters outside Murphy's General Store, their voices creating a low rumble of agitation that seemed to vibrate through the wooden boardwalks. Sarah White Elk stood in the cramped jail cell, her dark hands gripping the iron bars as she watched the crowd growing larger through the small window. At 24, she had learned to read the faces of white settlers with the same precision her grandmother had taught her to read the changing seasons. Today, those faces carried something that made her stomach tighten with fear. "They're saying you poisoned the Henderson boy," Sheriff Tom Bradley said quietly, his weathered face showing the strain of the past 3 days. He was a fair man, as far as Sarah could tell, but fairness didn't always matter when a town's blood was running hot. Doc Miller found some kind of plant residue in the boy's stomach. Sarah's voice remained steady, despite the tremor in her hands. "I gave him willow bark tea for his fever. Nothing more. The same remedy I've used on dozens of people in this town over the past 2 years. Sheriff Bradley removed his hat and ran his fingers through his graying hair. "I know that, Sarah. Hell, you saved my own daughter from pneumonia last winter with one of your remedies, but the Henderson family is calling for justice, and they've got half the town believing you used some kind of Indian poison on little Timothy." Through the window, Sarah could see Mrs. Henderson being supported by 2 other women as she wailed dramatically for anyone within earshot. The boy had died suddenly after a brief illness, and in a town where suspicion of outsiders ran as deep as the nearby creek beds, it didn't take long for accusations to find their target. "The territorial judge won't be through here for another month," Bradley continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "And Judge Morrison, well, he's not known for his sympathy toward Indian defendants." Sarah had heard the stories about Judge Morrison, a man who believed that the only way to deal with what he called the Indian problem was through swift and decisive action. She closed her eyes and tried to push away the image of the makeshift gallows that some of the men had started discussing outside the saloon. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew both Sarah and the sheriff to the window. A dust cloud was rising on the horizon, growing larger as it approached the town. Sheriff Bradley squinted against the afternoon sun, trying to make out the identity of the approaching rider. "Looks like trouble coming from 3 directions today," he muttered, checking his pocket watch. "Town council's meeting in an hour to discuss your situation." Sarah knew what that meant. The town council consisted of 5 men: Mayor Caldwell, who owned the largest ranch in the county; Reverend Matthews, whose sermons often focused on the dangers of mixing with heathen peoples; Dr. Miller, who had been drinking heavily since young Timothy's death; banker Harold Price, who saw everything through the lens of property values and business interests; and merchant Patrick Murphy, whose general store served as the unofficial center of town gossip. "Mrs. Henderson has been going house to house since yesterday," Sheriff Bradley said, settling into the wooden chair beside his desk. "She's convinced half the women in town that you've been poisoning their children slowly, building up some kind of resistance in Indian kids while weakening white children." The absurdity of the accusation would have been laughable under different circumstances. Sarah had been living peacefully in Cedar Falls for 2 years, working as a seamstress and occasional healer. She had helped birth children, tended to injuries, and even taught some of the local women how to preserve food using traditional methods her grandmother had passed down. But peace was a fragile thing in Wyoming Territory, where the memory of conflicts with local tribes still burned fresh in many minds. Sarah's presence had been tolerated when times were good, but tolerance had a way of evaporating when fear took hold. The jail door opened with a screech of rusty hinges, and Deputy Mills entered with a worried expression. "Sheriff, you need to see this," he said, holding up a crumpled piece of paper. "Someone slipped this under the door of the church this morning." Sheriff Bradley unfolded the paper and read silently, his face growing pale. "It's a petition," he said finally. 43 signatures demanding immediate justice for Timothy Henderson's murder. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. 43 signatures in a town of barely 200 people meant that nearly every adult male had signed the document. In the frontier justice system, such a petition carried weight that could override legal procedures. "There's more," Deputy Mills continued reluctantly. "They're planning to meet tonight after the council session. Word is they don't want to wait for the territorial judge." The meaning was clear. A lynch mob was forming, and Sarah was running out of time. She'd seen it happen before in other towns, other territories. Fear and suspicion could turn ordinary people into a dangerous crowd faster than a prairie fire could consume dry grass. Outside, the crowd continued to grow, and the voices were getting louder, more agitated. Sarah could make out individual words now. Murderer, savage, justice. The sound sent chills down her spine, not because she feared death, but because she feared dying for a crime she hadn't committed, leaving behind a town that would learn nothing from the tragedy. Sheriff Bradley stood up and checked his rifle, though Sarah noticed his hands shaking slightly as he did so. "I'll do what I can to keep you safe until the judge arrives," he said quietly. "But I can't promise much if this crowd decides to take matters into their own hands." As if summoned by his words, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed from the boardwalk outside. Through the window, Sarah could see the dust cloud from the mysterious rider had reached the edge of town, though the figure was still too distant to identify clearly. The stranger who changed everything. The rider dismounted from his horse with the careful movements of a man who had spent countless hours in the saddle. James MacReady was tall and lean, his sun-weathered face bearing the lines of someone who had seen both the beauty and brutality of the frontier. At 42, he owned one of the most successful cattle ranches in the territory, but more importantly, he had a reputation for fairness that extended far beyond the borders of his own land. James tied his horse to the hitching post outside the sheriff's office and paused to survey the crowd that had gathered. He recognized most of the faces. These were his neighbors, people he had shared meals with, traded cattle with, and considered friends. But today, their faces carried an ugliness that made his stomach turn. "Afternoon, folks," James said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that came from years of managing both cattle and men. "Seems like quite a gathering for a Tuesday." Mayor Caldwell stepped forward from the crowd, his round face flushed red from the heat and excitement. "James, good to see you. We're dealing with a serious situation here. That Indian woman poisoned the Henderson boy, and we're making sure justice gets served." James had known Timothy Henderson since the boy was born. He had also known Sarah White Elk for the past 2 years, ever since she had arrived in Cedar Falls. She had sewn shirts for his ranch hands, treated a nasty infection on his foreman's leg, and had never caused a moment of trouble for anyone. "That's a serious accusation, Mayor," James replied calmly. "What evidence do you have?" Dr. Miller pushed through the crowd, his medical bag clutched tightly in his hand. The doctor's breath carried the sharp smell of whiskey, and his eyes were bloodshot from grief and alcohol. "I found plant matter in the boy's stomach," he said, his words slightly slurred. "Some kind of Indian poison. She killed him, sure as I'm standing here." James studied the doctor's face carefully. "What kind of plant matter, Doc? Did you identify it specifically?" "Well, Dr. Miller hesitated, suddenly looking less certain. "It was some kind of herbal mixture, the kind of thing these people use in their witchcraft." "Witchcraft?" James raised an eyebrow. "Doc, you've been practicing medicine for 20 years. Since when do you diagnose witchcraft?" Mrs. Henderson broke free from the women supporting her and rushed toward James, her face streaked with tears. "Mr. MacReady, that woman killed my boy. She gave him some kind of poison tea, and now he's dead. You have to help us get justice." James removed his hat respectfully as Mrs. Henderson approached. He had genuine sympathy for her loss. Losing a child was a pain he wouldn't wish on anyone. But grief, he knew, could cloud judgment as surely as whiskey clouded Dr. Miller's. "Mrs. Henderson, I'm truly sorry for your loss," he said gently. "Timothy was a good boy, and I know how much you loved him. But are you certain about what happened? Did you see Sarah give him anything harmful?" "She gave him tea," Mrs. Henderson sobbed. "Some kind of Indian tea for his fever. The next morning he was burning up worse than before, and by evening he was—" She couldn't finish the sentence. James nodded thoughtfully. "And had Timothy been sick before Sarah gave him the tea?" "Well, yes, he had a fever for 3 days, but—" "And did the tea seem to help at first?" Mrs. Henderson paused, confusion flickering across her tear-streaked face. Yes, he seemed better that evening. He ate some soup and even smiled. But then, sometimes, James said carefully, children get sicker before they get better. Sometimes fevers break on their own, and sometimes they don't. That doesn't mean anyone poisoned them." Reverend Matthews stepped forward, his black coat making him look like a crow among the dusty crowd. "Mr. MacReady, with all due respect, you weren't there. You didn't see what we saw. This woman has been practicing her heathen medicine on our children for 2 years. Who knows how many she's slowly poisoned?" James turned to face the Reverend directly. "Reverend, in those 2 years, how many children in this town have died of mysterious illnesses?" "Well, Timothy—" "Before Timothy," James interrupted. "How many children died mysteriously while Sarah was treating them?" The Reverend opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. The crowd began to murmur among themselves, and James could see doubt beginning to creep into some of their faces. "I'll tell you how many," James continued, his voice growing stronger. "None. In fact, from what I've observed, childhood deaths from fever and sickness have gone down since Sarah arrived. My own foreman's son recovered from a lung infection that Dr. Miller said would probably kill him." Dr. Miller's face flushed an even deeper red. "That's not the point. The point is that this woman used some kind of Indian medicine on Timothy, and now he's dead. We can't let her get away with murder just because she helped a few other people." James walked closer to the crowd, making eye contact with individual faces. "So let me understand this. Sarah has successfully treated dozens of people over 2 years. She's never harmed anyone. She's been a productive member of this community. But because one child died after she tried to help him, a child who was already gravely ill, you want to hang her without a trial. The territorial judge won't be here for a month," Mayor Caldwell protested. "We can't keep her locked up that long with feeling running this high. And besides, what if she escapes? What if she goes back to her people and brings them here for revenge?" "What if she's innocent?" James asked quietly. "What if you hang an innocent woman based on grief and suspicion? What kind of town does that make us?" The crowd fell silent for a moment, but then Patrick Murphy spoke up from the back. "Easy words from a man who doesn't have children, MacReady. Easy to be philosophical when it's not your boy lying in the ground." James felt the familiar sting of that particular wound. It was true. He had never married, never had children of his own. But that didn't mean he couldn't recognize injustice when he saw it. "You're right, Murphy," James said evenly. "I don't have children, but I do have a conscience. And my conscience tells me that what you're planning here isn't justice. It's murder, when truth meets fear." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife as James MacReady's words hung over the crowd. Sheriff Bradley emerged from his office, drawn by the heated voices, and positioned himself between James and the increasingly agitated townspeople. "Now hold on, everyone," Bradley said, raising his hands in a gesture meant to calm the crowd. "Let's not say things we can't take back. James, I appreciate your concern, but we have a situation here that needs handling." James turned to face the sheriff directly. "Tom, you've known me for 8 years. Have I ever steered you wrong? Have I ever acted without thinking things through?" Sheriff Bradley's weathered face showed the strain of a man caught between duty and friendship. "No, James, you haven't. But this is different. The whole town is up in arms, and I've got to keep the peace." "Then let me see her," James said firmly. "Let me talk to Sarah and hear her side of the story. If she's guilty of what you're accusing her of, I'll walk away and let you handle it your way. But if there's any doubt—" "Absolutely not," Dr. Miller interrupted, his voice shaking with emotion and whiskey. "This isn't some cattle dispute where you can just talk things out, MacReady. A child is dead and we know who killed him." James stepped closer to the doctor, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. "Do we, Doc? Do we really know? Or do we just think we know because it's easier to blame someone who looks different than to admit that sometimes children die despite our best efforts?" The crowd began to murmur more loudly, with some voices supporting James and others calling for immediate action. Mrs. Henderson collapsed into sobs again, and Reverend Matthews moved to comfort her while shooting accusatory glances at James. "You didn't see my boy suffering?" Mrs. Henderson cried out. "You didn't watch him burn with fever and then go cold. That woman did something to him. I know it in my heart." James removed his hat and approached Mrs. Henderson with genuine compassion. "Ma'am, I can't imagine your pain. Losing a child is the worst thing that can happen to anyone. But grief can make us see things that aren't there, blame people who don't deserve it." "How dare you?" Patrick Murphy shouted from the back of the crowd. "How dare you tell this woman her grief is making her see things? Her boy is dead, and that Indian witch killed him." The word witch seemed to electrify the crowd, and James could see the dangerous shift from anger to something approaching hysteria. He had seen it before during his time as a soldier in the Civil War, the moment when a group of people stopped thinking as individuals and became something more primitive and dangerous. Sheriff Bradley must have sensed it too, because his hand moved instinctively to his gun. "All right, that's enough," he shouted. "Everyone calm down before someone gets hurt." James seized the moment of silence that followed. "Tom, 5 minutes. Give me 5 minutes to talk to her, and then I'll tell you what I think happened here." "And if you're wrong," Mayor Caldwell demanded, "if she really did poison that boy, and we listened to you, how many more children might die?" "If I'm wrong," James said steadily, "then you can proceed with whatever justice you think is appropriate. But if I'm right, you'll have saved this town from making a mistake it can never undo." Sheriff Bradley looked from James to the crowd and back again. Finally, he nodded slowly. 5 minutes, James, but I'm staying right there with you." The two men walked toward the jail entrance, leaving the crowd behind them buzzing with arguments and speculation. As they entered the building, James could hear Mrs. Henderson's renewed sobs and Reverend Matthews leading the crowd in what sounded like an impromptu prayer. Sarah White Elk stood at the back of her cell, her dark eyes watching James with a mixture of hope and wariness. She had heard enough of the conversation outside to know that this man was trying to help her, but experience had taught her to be cautious about trusting white men, even those who seemed sympathetic. "Miss White Elk," James said, approaching the cell bars. "My name is James MacReady. I own a ranch about 10 miles south of here. I want to hear your side of what happened with Timothy Henderson." Sarah studied his face for a long moment before speaking. "Why do you care what I have to say? Your people have already decided I'm guilty." "They're not my people," James replied quietly. "They're my neighbors, but that doesn't mean they're right. Now please tell me exactly what happened when you treated Timothy." Sarah took a deep breath and moved closer to the bars. "Mrs. Henderson brought him to me 3 days before he died. He had a high fever and was complaining of stomach pain. I gave him willow bark tea to reduce the fever and some mint leaves to settle his stomach." "Had you treated Timothy before?" "Yes, twice. Once for a cut on his hand and once for a cough last winter. Both times Mrs. Henderson was grateful for my help." James nodded thoughtfully. "What happened after you gave him the tea?" "His fever broke that evening. Mrs. Henderson was so relieved she cried. Timothy even asked for food, which he hadn't done in days." Sarah's voice grew quieter. "The next morning Mrs. Henderson came back, but she was angry. She said Timothy was worse than ever." "Did you see him that second day?" Sarah shook her head. "She wouldn't let me. She said I had done enough and took him straight to Dr. Miller. That was the last time I saw either of them until—" She gestured toward the window where the crowd could still be heard. Sheriff Bradley had been listening intently. "Sarah, is there anything else you gave Timothy? Anything besides the willow bark and mint?" "Nothing," Sarah said firmly. "I would never harm a child. In my grandmother's teachings, children are sacred. Harming a child is the worst sin anyone can commit." James was quiet for a moment, processing what he had heard. Finally, he turned to Sheriff Bradley. "Tom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. How long had Timothy been sick before his mother brought him to Sarah?" Sheriff Bradley shifted uncomfortably. "Well, Mrs. Henderson said he'd had stomach problems for about a week before the fever started." "Stomach problems," James repeated. "And did anyone think to ask what might have caused those stomach problems?" Before Sheriff Bradley could answer, the sound of shouting erupted from outside. Through the window, they could see the crowd had grown larger and more agitated. Someone had brought rope, the truth that saved a life. The sight of the rope being carried through the crowd sent a chill down James MacReady's spine. He had seen lynch mobs before, and he knew that once they reached this point, reason became nearly impossible. But he also knew something else, something that might save Sarah White Elk's life if he could prove it. "Tom, I need you to trust me one more time," James said urgently to Sheriff Bradley. "Keep that crowd outside for 10 more minutes. I think I know what really killed Timothy Henderson." Sheriff Bradley looked skeptical, but nodded. 10 minutes, James. After that, I can't guarantee anyone's safety." James hurried outside, pushing through the agitated crowd until he found Dr. Miller. The doctor was swaying slightly, his medical bag forgotten at his feet, as he watched the preparations for what was clearly going to be an illegal execution. "Doc, I need to ask you about Timothy's symptoms," James said, grabbing the man's arm to steady him. "You said he had stomach problems before the fever started?" Dr. Miller's eyes were unfocused, but he nodded. "Poor boy was sick for over a week. Couldn't keep food down, terrible stomach cramps. And what did you diagnose that as?" "Well, Dr. Miller paused, seeming to struggle with his memory. "I thought it might be something he ate. Bad meat, maybe, or spoiled milk." James felt his pulse quicken. "Doc, did you examine Timothy's body after he died? I mean, really examine it?" "Of course I did. I'm a doctor. And what did you find in his stomach besides the plant matter from Sarah's tea?" Dr. Miller's face went pale, and for a moment his drunken haze seemed to clear. There was other material, partially digested food, but also what, Doc?" "There were some kind of seeds, small, dark seeds. I didn't think much of it at the time because I was focused on the Indian medicine." James felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place in his mind. Seeds? What kind of seeds? Before Dr. Miller could answer, Mrs. Henderson appeared beside them, her face streaked with tears, but her eyes blazing with anger. "Why are you asking him these questions? We know what killed my boy." James turned to face her with as much gentleness as he could muster. "Mrs. Henderson, I need to ask you something important. In the week before Timothy got sick, did he eat anything unusual? Anything he might have found outside?" "What kind of question is that?" she demanded. "My boy didn't eat random things off the ground." "Ma'am, I'm not suggesting he did it on purpose, but children sometimes eat things they shouldn't. Berries, seeds, plants they find interesting." Mrs. Henderson's anger faltered slightly, replaced by confusion. "Well, he did. There was one day he came home with his mouth stained purple. I thought maybe he'd been eating berries with the other children." "What kind of berries?" "I don't know. I scolded him and told him not to eat things he found in the woods." James felt his heart racing. "Mrs. Henderson, did Timothy ever go near the Henderson Creek area, down by the old mill?" "He played there sometimes with the other boys," she admitted reluctantly. "But what does that have to do with anything?" James turned to address the entire crowd, raising his voice so everyone could hear. "Folks, I think I know what really killed Timothy Henderson, and it wasn't Sarah White Elk." The crowd fell silent, their attention focused entirely on James. Even the men with the rope stopped their preparations to listen. 3 years ago, my foreman lost 2 calves near Henderson Creek," James continued. "We found them dead near a patch of pokeweed that had gone to seed. The seeds of pokeweed are extremely poisonous, especially to children." Dr. Miller's face went white as understanding dawned. "Sweet Jesus," he whispered, "the seeds in Timothy's stomach. Pokeweed seeds, James said firmly. Timothy ate pokeweed seeds while playing by the creek. The poison built up in his system over several days, causing the stomach problems and eventually the fever. By the time his mother brought him to Sarah, he was already dying. Mrs. Henderson staggered backward as if she'd been struck. No, that can't be right. The Indian woman gave him something. I saw her. She gave him willow bark tea, James explained patiently. The same medicine white doctors have been using for centuries to reduce fever. It helped temporarily, which is why Timothy seemed better that evening. But by the next morning, the pokeweed poison had progressed too far for any medicine to help. Sheriff Bradley had joined the crowd and was listening intently. James, are you certain about this? Doc Miller can confirm it, James said, turning to the physician. If you examine those seeds you found in Timothy's stomach, you'll see they're pokeweed seeds, not anything Sarah gave him. Dr. Miller nodded slowly, his hands shaking as the full weight of what had almost happened began to sink in. He's right. Those were pokeweed seeds. I should have recognized them immediately, but I was so focused on blaming the Indian woman. The crowd began to murmur among themselves, and James could see the anger slowly transforming into confusion and shame. Mrs. Henderson collapsed onto her knees in the dusty street, sobbing uncontrollably. "My boy," she wailed. "My poor boy, we almost—" Reverend Matthews moved to comfort her, but his own face showed the horror of what they had nearly done. "We almost hanged an innocent woman," he said quietly. Mayor Caldwell stepped forward, his face flushed with embarrassment. "James, if you're right about this—" "I am right," James said firmly. "And if you don't believe me, take a ride down to Henderson Creek. You'll find pokeweed growing all along the banks, and this time of year it's full of those same dark seeds." The crowd began to disperse slowly, with many people unable to meet each other's eyes. The shame of what they had almost done hung over them like a dark cloud. Sheriff Bradley unlocked Sarah's cell, and she emerged into the fading afternoon light, free but clearly shaken by her ordeal. "Miss White Elk," James said as she stepped outside, "I'm sorry for what you've been through. This town owes you an apology and a debt of gratitude." Sarah looked at him with eyes that held both relief and sadness. "Mr. MacReady, thank you for believing in the truth, but I think it's time for me to leave Cedar Falls." "You don't have to leave," James replied. "This is your home now." Sarah smiled sadly as she gathered her few belongings. "A home is a place where people trust you. I don't think I can ever have that here again." As she walked away down the dusty main street, James realized she was probably right. Some wounds, once opened, never fully healed, but at least she was walking away alive, carrying the truth with her into whatever future awaited her beyond the borders of Cedar Falls.